Hi everyone, welcome. We'll give it a minute for everyone to filter in from the waiting room. Feel free to go ahead and introduce yourselves, your name, where you're calling in from in the chat. We'll give it one more minute for everyone to come through. Welcome everyone. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat as you're coming in. We'll give it about 30 more seconds for more people to come in from the waiting room. Oh, I'm seeing chat is disabled. Okay, we can fix that. Good call. Thank you. All right, the chat should be on now. Feel free to go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. Thanks to everyone who flagged that. Appreciate all of your tech support. All right, it's 2:32. I think the filtering in from the waiting room is slowing down, so I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. I'm Courtney Cooperman. Oh, sorry, I've got to assign captioner. Give me 1 second. Want to make sure we have the closed captioning. Yes. All right, we should be good to go now. Thank you for dealing with my sorting out all of the tech. I'm Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer here at NLIHC. I'm excited to welcome you all to the latest installment in the Our Homes, Our Votes webinar series on voting while experiencing homelessness. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded. The recording and resources will be sent out afterwards, but it's actually going to look a little bit different this time than what you might be used to if you've been attending these webinars. So instead of getting a summary email tomorrow, we're actually sending out a new all NLIHC summary email called The Connection that goes out on Fridays. So on Friday, you're going to get an email called The Connection, where you can find the recordings and resources from all of our calls that take place this week. And if you just click Our Homes, Our Votes in that email, you'll get the resources from this call as you usually would. So we have closed captioning, we have recording, and if you please encourage everyone to ask questions in the Q&A throughout the webinar. I'm really excited to welcome our guest panelists, Kat Calvin, founder of Project ID and Spread the Vote, Sue Corby from Welcome Manchester, and Jessica Margeson from the Granite State Organizing Project. Before I pass it to them, my colleague Sidney Betancourt is going to make an announcement about the latest edition of Tenant Talk. But actually, even before I pass it to Sid, I'm going to take a little more time today than I usually do to give an extended introduction to our topic of voting while experiencing homelessness, because I actually wrote my honors thesis in college on this topic. So I just want to share a little bit of what I learned through that process of writing my thesis and some key takeaways and why this topic matters so much to me and to all of us here. So I know we've talked a lot on this webinar series about why voting matters for housing justice. We know that elected officials are responsive to their constituents who vote, that their constituents are the ones, their voting constituents are the ones who have the power to keep them in office or vote them out of the job. And we've seen a lot of instances, not only of elected officials being unresponsive to the needs of people experiencing homelessness, but really not even treating them as constituents at all. When I was doing my thesis research, I saw some really egregious examples of this. Some people who I interviewed told me a story about law enforcement removing people experiencing homelessness from a city council meeting because they thought they were there loitering, while they were actually there to testify, to exercise their voice as citizens. So we see that elected officials often forget that voters in their community may be experiencing homelessness, and they need to treat them as equal human beings and equal citizens. And one way to remind elected officials of this fact is to make sure that people experiencing homelessness are empowered to vote. But a lot of people may make the assumption that because people experiencing homelessness don't have a permanent address, they may not even be eligible to vote. And that is not the case at all. This question actually first came up in the 1980s, the time when homelessness as we know it today was first becoming a problem as the Nixon and Reagan administrations cut funding for federal housing programs. In 1984, a group of unhoused citizens sued the New York Election Board for denying them the right to vote because they did not have residential addresses. This case, Pitts versus Black, ruled that the state's definition of residency, that limited residency just to a home address, was unconstitutional because it disenfranchised unhoused citizens. The court claims that the state could expand the residency criteria to include any place where a person regularly returns, like a park bench or a street corner. So fortunately, if we go on to the next slide, we can see the National Voter Registration Form, which does include a space where you can designate, like on a little map, a place where you're staying and establish that as your place of residency. So that's a way that you can put down where your residency is, even if you don't have a home address. But many aspects of election procedure, how this information is actually processed, are set by states. And some states make it easier than others for your voter registration to be validated and to go about the process of actually voting if you don't have that permanent address. So we can go on to the next slide. Oh yeah, we're on the Oregon slide. Great, okay. So one example of a state that makes this process pretty clear and accessible is Oregon. Their Secretary of State's website specifically clarifies that an unhoused person can use the county election clerk's office as their mailing address to receive election-related mail. Now, this is what's on the website. If you have worked in Oregon and have not seen this to be the case, please weigh in the chat. But in terms of what their official procedure is, they make it very accessible. On the next slide, we have a state that makes this process a little bit more burdensome, which is Minnesota. Again, this is all from the website. If you have worked directly in Minnesota and this does not reflect your experience, please share in the chat. We really want to learn more about what this looks like on the ground. But according to the Secretary of State's website, people who register before Election Day using an outdoor location as their residence will need to swear under oath that they're living at that location. If they register on the day of the election, they need to bring another registered voter from their precinct or a shelter staff person to confirm where they're living. So these two websites, Oregon and Minnesota, are examples of websites that are actually really good about communicating the procedures. Even if those procedures are burdensome, at least the website lays out very clearly what they are. But some states don't make that information quite as public. But just because the information isn't publicly posted doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And the best bet is to always check in with your county clerk or state elections office to determine that voter registration process. And that brings us to the USICH, the US Interagency Council on Homelessness guide that was recently released. So to help kind of demystify this process and make sure that information about voting is out there in the community, USICH recently released 2 voting guides. The first is a step-by-step voting guide for people experiencing homelessness themselves to make sure they know what to do to go about registering and ensure that they can cast their ballots. And Sid just dropped the link to that one in the chat. And the next is a checklist for service providers to make sure that they're prepared to help their clients register to vote. So I'm not going to go through all the steps right now, but definitely encourage you to check out those links. I also just want to mention a really great resource that is referenced in these voter guides, which are some pro tips from our partners at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, who put together an Everyone Votes toolkit with specific guidance for registering and educating and mobilizing voters experiencing homelessness. So some of the really innovative tips that they include in that toolkit includes to engage volunteers and partners. I know capacity is always a concern. Adding voter engagement on top of a lot of other work can be a lot. So always leverage partnerships in the community. The second is to discuss with your local election office the possibility of your organization being a polling site or perhaps hosting a mail-in ballot drop box. In some places, it may be too late for 2022, but it's never too early for 2023 and 2024 to start looking into that. The third is to satisfy address requirements by having your organization agree to collect mail on behalf of clients and to make sure there's a process for getting mail to clients that have moved to another facility. So kind of like Oregon's election office saying that your county clerk can be a mailing address, it's really helpful for a service provider to offer themselves as a mailing address for election mail. The fourth is just to kind of, as always, contact your election office, determine what kind of support you can provide for registration and collecting forms. And the fifth is to waive curfew or waiting in line practices on election day and replace these with reservations or tickets to eliminate stress and disincentives to vote and really make sure that people experiencing homelessness can have that flexibility to get to their polling places. Another resource that brings me to our next speaker, Sidney Betancourt from NLIHC, is our new edition of Tenant Talk, which gets into some of this and other helpful tips. So with that, I'll pass it to Sid.
Thanks, Courtney. And hi, everybody. My name is Sidney Betancourt. For those that haven't met me before, I'm a housing advocacy organizer with the coalition, and my pronouns are she, hers. I also help facilitate Tenant Talk Live, which happens every Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And I'm here and very happy to discuss the new issue of Tenant Talk, and we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the new issue, as I said, is now available, and Tenant Talk is a semi-annual newsletter that is created by NLIHC to engage renters and residents in housing advocacy. And this specific issue, titled Housing is Built with Ballots, is focusing on non-partisan election engagement. And so we have a lot of resources in there for you all, and I'm very excited for you all to dig into it. Next slide, please. So we have a lot of resources and information in there. So here are just some examples of the resources that we have in there. So if you want to be aware of any voter suppression laws that are in your states, we have those listed out according to the ones that have passed from 2020 and onward. We also have a kind of like a spreadsheet, I guess, of how the states are voting so that you're aware of like when to register to vote, when the polling stations are open, and if you can mail in your ballot and stuff like that. And then there's also how to engage candidates as a tenant or a resident, which is really important because we want to make sure that y'all use your voice in these elections. And then next slide, thank you so much. And we also have a renter perspective and a resident perspective in this Tenant Talk as well. Really good to always learn from folks on the ground. So really awesome ones. I help work with both of them, so I'm really excited for y'all to read those. But yeah, that's just a little bit about this issue of Tenant Talk. Courtney just dropped like the digital version of it. And I just confirmed that I can still take some folks who haven't signed up for like the paper copy of it. So I don't usually do this, but I want to give y'all a chance to sign up if you haven't signed up yet. So if you've signed up in the past for a copy of Tenant Talk, whether it was this issue or not, we already have your information in the system. So unless you have like an address change, there's no need to submit your information again. But if this is your first time getting a Tenant Talk, please feel free to sign up. But I'll drop that link in the chat shortly. And yeah, thank you so much, Courtney. There's my info for y'all.
Thank you so much, Sid. We're so excited about this edition of Tenant Talk. I definitely encourage everyone who's been attending this series to check it out. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kat.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kat Calvin. I'm going to give the briefest of overviews about IDs. I could talk for hours. I will try not to, but you have my email here, and I will also throw it into the chat so that you can ask me any questions afterwards or at the Q&A. But basically what I wanted to chat a bit about was IDs, both how they impact voting and how they impact housing, and how those are connected. My organization, Spread the Vote Plus Project ID, helps folks get government-issued photo IDs, usually DMV IDs, on the ground in 17 states. I was scrolling through, I saw Path, which is one of our partners in LA. I bet there are some others, there are a bunch, and I was trying to scroll and see them. So hi to folks who work with us. You know what we do for most of you who work with the unhoused or low-income housing, etc. You know how important IDs are. You also know how hard they are to get and how expensive they are. And so what we do is we help folks get all the documents they need with transportation. We pay for everything. We basically do whatever we can to get IDs into folks' hands. We also have a 501c4, the Project ID Action Fund, which is working on changing ID policy large scale. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But I wanted to talk a bit about starting with IDs and how they impact housing. You guys are experts, you probably know, so I'm just gonna throw some things out there to get us all level set, and because I think that we often sort of don't think about how much these things connect with voting. When I first started this organization, I was like, oh, people need IDs to vote. We'll just get them IDs to vote. And then I went out and spoke to folks and they were like, well, I need an ID for a house or for a job or these other things. And I can't even think about voting because I don't know where I'm laying my head at night or how I'm feeding my kids, right? And so one of the things that we are always trying to talk to folks who are not who are not experts and who don't really think about it is, if we want people to vote, they also need to have the things that they need just to have safety and security in their lives, because you can't think about civic action if you are, unsure about where you're going to sleep or where your next meal is coming from. And so when we think about IDs, one of the things, I'm sure you're all seeing this too, once you become unhoused, whether that is because you've been evicted or you've lost your job or you've been kicked out of home or however it is, your chances of losing your documents and your ID increase exponentially. This is one of those common sense things that people don't think about, but then when you say, well, you don't have anywhere to put your stuff, right, then it becomes pretty obvious to folks. And so we see people who, first of all, police sweeps, which is a huge problem here in Los Angeles. They throw everything away. They very frequently throw IDs and birth certificates away. Things get stolen, things get lost, you're out in the rain, right? But the problem is, once you lose that ID, you lose your access to social services, you lose your access to jobs, you lose your access to housing. Pretty much every housing placement program on the planet requires ID. You lose your access to basic healthcare, to all of these things. And then because you don't have that, getting the money and the capability of being able to get the documents to be able to get your ID becomes almost impossible, right? And so we end up in this cycle of folks not having the thing they need to get the things they need, which they need to get the thing they need. And so that's one reason why we sort of come in and are like, we'll just stop this cycle now and help you get the documents, get the ID. If any of you have tried to help someone get an out-of-state birth certificate, I have yelled at many county clerks. I'm sure I will pay for it in my next lifetime, because it's really hard and it's also expensive. And so what we think about when we are talking about IDs, it's this small key that opens the door to everything you need to rebuild your life. The other thing that it does, though, in 35 states, but honestly, we don't have voter IDs in California, but I need an ID to vote in my neighborhood council election. It's very annoying. One day I'm going to burn it down. But you need an ID in the majority of the country to vote. And even if you live in a state where you don't necessarily need ID, again, it becomes that access thing. And what happens is, if we're looking at the over 21 million American adults who don't have ID, they are vastly low or no income, right? Obviously, you can't get a job without an ID, and if you had a job, then you'd have an ID. They are often unhoused, or they're extremely at-risk housing. They're often returning citizens. A lot of times foster kids, when foster kids age out of the system, one thing that they don't get in most states is the documents they need to restart their lives. Often we also have a huge problem with seniors who don't have IDs because the requirements increased significantly after 9/11. And so there are a lot of seniors who didn't get birth certificates because they were born at home or in Jim Crow towns, all sorts of things. And now having to get a birth certificate for someone who's never had one is a nightmare. It's more difficult than it should be in every state, but it bars people from being able to get that ID. And so what it means that because of voter ID laws, which we hate, but they're not going anywhere anytime soon. We know that. And so what happens is we now have prevented this huge portion of the population who are most impacted by government decisions from being able to access the vote that lets them decide who's representing them in the government. We have a problem in California because only 2 members of our massive state assembly are renters. Think about that. 2 people out of our entire state assembly of the most populous state in the nation rent. So when you wonder why California doesn't have rent control, that's why, right? But a vast majority of the people who desperately need affordable housing, which is a thing we do not have in this state, even remotely, can't vote. And you don't even need an ID to vote here, but the access of being able to go from your tent on Skid Row to go to the polls, to be able to know who you're voting for, all of that, it's really difficult, right? And so we now have all but 2 people are homeowners in the state assembly, and we can see the results of that. And so one of the things that oh my God, I'm talking so fast, my time is gone. One of the things that I think it's really important for us to think about when we are working with folks who are either unhoused or have seriously at-risk housing, etc., is that IDs are everything, and it is really critical that we make sure that they can get IDs. If you are we work in 17 states, but there are folks from all over, including my favorite state, Alaska. I saw there was someone from Anchorage. Hello, I've been to all 50 states. You're all wonderful, but Alaska is the best state. There's just nothing I can do about it. It's the truth. Please get in touch with me because we love partnering with organizations like yours to help your community, our communities, all of our staff and volunteers live in the communities they serve, be able to get the IDs that they need that can help them escape homelessness, can help them maintain their housing, etc. And then the last thing, so on our C4 side, we are working on a bill in Congress that will be introduced next month that will significantly expand access to IDs for exactly the folks that we work with. I would love to also talk to any of you about that if you may be interested in supporting that work. So email me. You have my email on the screen. kat@spreadthevote.org is great. I have 500 emails like we all do. That one I check every day because I would love to talk about how we can help make sure your folks have IDs. We also make voter guides for a lot of different parts of the country that are specifically designed for our communities that we can share with you. And we can work with you in many of the states that you're in helping you be able to get IDs for your community. We can pay for them. We can help with the documents, etc. It's critical. And I'll just end with just hammering down the point that I always hammer down on, that voting and housing security are completely intertwined. It is very difficult to ask someone with insecure housing to care about voting when they need a place for their family to sleep at night. So we've got to make sure that people are able to do both. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kat. So I wanted to ask you a question in terms of like what this looks kind of logistically. So you are working with someone who doesn't have an ID and has that kind of serious, is stuck in that cycle. What is your first step? Could you kind of walk us through what it looks like to go from someone who is trapped in that cycle of not having an ID to then getting one?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we do is we sit down and we do intake with each client and ask them questions based on whatever the rules are to get an ID at the DMV in that state. Or if you're in Florida, it's the tax collector. If you're in Michigan, it's the Secretary of State. I call them all the DMV. And so we'll go through and we'll say, okay, do you have a birth certificate? Do you have your social security card? Do you have proofs of residency, et cetera, right? And we'll figure out what they already have. Sometimes they have some things, often they have nothing. And then we'll go through and we'll figure out how to get each thing. And we'll start with the birth certificate, if they need a social security card in that state with that, you know, proof of residency. But basically it's just a matter, I always say we're part social worker and part Sherlock Holmes, of going individually, working with each client and getting them every single document that they need, so that then we can walk into the DMV with the stack of documents and then get them their ID.
Awesome. I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat, a lot of appreciation for what you're doing, some organizations that are doing similar work. We got a question from Brian. Is there a website with a listing by state of where individuals can obtain an ID?
No, because so it's basically in every state. It's you're looking at whatever your sort of DMV is, right? So like I was saying, it has different words. It's the tax collector in Florida generally. It's it's called the Secretary of State in Michigan. But wherever you go, ID and driver. And I should say this because people get confused. There's a driver's license, and then the walker's ID is basically the same kind of ID, except it doesn't allow you to drive. So wherever you go in your state to get a driver's license would be the same place that you're going to get that state ID.
Great. We also got a question in the Q&A from Aaron, not exclusively about IDs, but I think very related, probably something that you can speak to. Here in Florida, there is Amendment 4, where if a person owes court fines and has liens against them, their voter rights are suspended until they pay off their fines and financial obligations. Are there actions to identify this hindering factor as election season kicks off?
Florida and Amendment 4. How many drinks have I had over this one? There have been actions in the past. One of the big challenges that folks have been really working on in Florida and really in every state is that, unsurprisingly, the courts and the state government, nobody really keeps track of what these fines are. And there's not a place that a person can go and find out what do I owe and where do I pay it off for each county. And so there have been a lot of really good efforts that have been ongoing since Amendment 4 passed, and since sort of all of the drama over the last few years, to try to raise money to pay those off, to try to build tools that help folks figure out what fines there are. There's actually, one of the things that we do is that in many states, and this is a thing they're starting to work on, luckily, in many states, but usually if you have fines and fees, which it is impossible to get out of incarceration without owing some sorts of fines and fees, they block your ability to get a driver's license, which of course means that you can't drive to a job to pay off your fines and fees. And so we have a fines and fees fund so that we can work on helping our clients, which, very frequently it's thousands of dollars, be able to raise the funds to help them pay off those fines. And we often have the same problem where they'll know, okay, I have fines in these 2 counties, we'll pay them off, we'll go to get their ID, and suddenly a third fine that we didn't know about and that no one had found before shows up in another county. And so this is one of the sort of issues that exists in every state that folks are working on, but it's hard because the government is unorganized, and so it makes it difficult for us to really be organized in fighting it. But yes, Aaron, there are a lot of there are a good amount of folks that are trying to work that off and to pay off those fines.
Sounds incredibly frustrating. But there was actually, we put this in our newsletter a little while ago, a really interesting research paper on the impact of engagement with nonprofits on paying off fines and fees and how that increased voter turnout. So if you dig back into our past newsletters, I can also try to find that link and share it in the chat. I'll give one more question for Kat. And then if you continue asking questions, we'll get to some more at the very end. So CJ asked a question, are there movements to having identification easier to access? Some states are still hiding behind COVID protocols. And then next year, several states have to get universal national identification. So there's a few different pieces to that. I guess, could you speak to both the impact of COVID restrictions and then perhaps a little bit more about the bill that you're working on that was going to be introduced soon?
So COVID was a real nightmare. Every DMV was closed, and the Social Security Administration closed for 2 years because, you know, who needs the Social Security Administration? And you're right. So one of the big problems that happened, and that some states, you're absolutely right, are still doing, is they're, you know, they all closed for a while, all of the sort of DMVs and et cetera. And then they were appointment only. Many of them are reopened. There are some regions that are still doing appointment only. And sometimes, you know, we just had a DMV in Florida that had shut down because half the staff got COVID. So there are still some issues. They are really lightening up, and it's far fewer than it was a year ago and 2 years ago. So it's getting much, much, much better. And the Social Security, the SSA finally reopened in April, so that has been a real help. As for the movement, so we are working on a bill. Once it's introduced, I will be happy to I'll be doing a million webinars and telling everybody everything about it. But if you're interested, please get in touch. But what we're working on with this bill is a way of basically expanding access to IDs for everyone in the country for free. It's a really massive effort. It's my lifelong goal. I thought I'd be 80 before we even got it introduced. It's already happening. I'm just smiling ear to ear all the time. But basically, yes, what we're working on right now, what our C4 is working on, we're the only ID organization in the country, but we're working really hard all by ourselves and with great partners like you guys and folks who are our stakeholders in this work, is how can we increase access to IDs, both through Congress. We're also working on state policies, starting with veterans because, you know, every side of the aisle pretends they care about veterans. So if we can get them to create free IDs for veterans, then we can expand it for more and more demographics. And so what our C4 is I'm really, really working on is being able to increase ID access for everyone. Every other country in the world, pretty much, you just get an ID. It's just free and you have it, or it's like €5 and it's no big deal. We are the only country that makes it this difficult. And so that is what we're trying to do with the bill that will be introduced to Congress next year, as well, or next month, as well as with a bunch of state policy. So we are trying to create an ID movement. We definitely hope you will join us.
Thank you so much, Kat. We are very proud to be part of this ID movement and to have you here to get more people involved. We're definitely seeing some people in the chat that want to be in the loop on the bill. So definitely some follow-up to happen there. So thank you so, so much. I'm now going to pass it over to Sue and Jessica.
Hi, it'll take me just 1 second to switch over the video. I apologize. Sue, are you there?
Yes, I have to get that switched over too. Yeah. Well, Jessica,
Let you go ahead and start.
okay, while Jessica's doing that, I am Sue Corby. I live in Manchester, New Hampshire. I am part of Welcoming Manchester, which is a volunteer organization that strives to make Manchester a more welcoming city for immigrants and refugees. And we are currently working with another organization on voter education for refugees and immigrants, especially right now, how to register to vote, that process. People who become citizens speak English, but don't necessarily read at that complex level. I just want to say that I learned a lot already in this webinar about homelessness, or about the rights of people who are without housing to vote. And I can relate particularly to the ID issues, because sometimes immigrants and refugees have left their homes so quickly, or their homes have burnt down and all their documents have burnt down, or they just don't have them because they've had to run so quickly. So I really am glad to hear that there's some work being done to simplify the process of getting IDs. So in Manchester, New Hampshire, and throughout the state of New Hampshire, in order to vote, you have to register. And if you don't have a fixed, well, first of all, you can register with the homeless shelter. That can be your address, whether you're staying there or if they give you permission. They might give you permission if they're working with you, but you're not living there. Maybe some of the day shelters, I think Jessica would know this, maybe 1269, some of those places may let you use their address.
And
But-
in New Hampshire, if I could add right here, because it's important, what's important about New Hampshire is that you can even give a park address.
Yeah. What I was, where I was
can even-
going.
But the important thing is registering in that ward. So once, whatever address you give, you need to know what ward that is.
Well,
And that is the ward you can vote in.
what the, I think what you do is you go into the city clerk's office, you describe where you live, if it's a park bench or if it's down near the river, near the ball field, you describe where you live and they figure out what ward that is. And then you register with them. If you go, that's if you register prior to the election, which they really encourage because they have to have that conversation to figure out where you're staying most of the time and where you're, therefore, what ward you're going to vote in. If you go on election day and you guess that you're in the right ward, the voter registrant at the polls should allow you to register on election day. But if you give the wrong ward, then you're going to run around to the next ward and get discouraged. So it is better to do it in advance to make sure you go to the right ward when you're ready to vote.
Right, because for people
you'll
to
have
know,
to-
they just need to be 18 years of age or older, a United States citizen, or domiciled in the town or ward you choose to vote in. A driver's license, while we may think it attests to where we actually live, a driver's license is proof of identity and age. A birth certificate is a naturalization or something like akin to a passport. It's proof of citizenship. So you can prove your identity,
you-
age, and citizenship by signing a qualified voter affidavit under oath in front of an election official if you do not have documents. Every state is a little different. So I would check into your state first, but supposedly both the New Hampshire and US constitutions establish that a homeless person has the same right to vote as a person who owns, leases, or rents a home. And we must remember that voting is another way that those who are homeless are silenced. So any outreach you can create, I just started speaking to some people locally in our state about creating a type of outreach to try and get them to the locations and teach them how to do that. Try and do outreach in your state if you can, because we all know that the numbers who vote are drastically different from the numbers of our populations. And that's all I had.
I just want to add to that, that you will have to sign an affidavit. Everybody in the state who comes in without proof of domicile, without a utility bill or something that proves that they live where they say they're going to vote, needs to sign an affidavit, but they are rarely challenged. So that shouldn't be an issue. People just need to know they will have to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a few questions that have come in the chat that I think the two of you would be in a great position to answer. So Julia asked, can you talk a little bit more about the role of faith-based groups in overcoming voter barriers? And I know you're both working in kind of grassroots coalitions, and there may be faith-based groups that are taking part in those.
GSOP is a grassroots organization made up of faith-based organizations itself, actually. I'm not sure if there's much of a difference because all the organizations I work with have such heart that I wouldn't be able to measure the passion between them all. But I would say if I need something in another city, there's a church that knows another church they can call and ask for us. If I need something in another town for another, you need to go? No. Sorry about that. My kids are not used to this. If I need something in another city, the connection base is huge with faith-based organizations.
Yeah, for sure. Having that network, especially when you're sorting through all these complicated processes, can be so important. Sue, did you want to add anything to that?
No, the organization that Jessica is with has a strong church-related component, and they do work with faith-based organizations. We do, but not in the same directed fashion.
Great. And then Francine asked a question, and Kat, if you want to chime in on this one too, you're welcome to. Someone is experiencing homelessness and has a postal hold on their mail, and they get the mail at the post office. How does that work for them?
In New Hampshire, you have to have more than a post office. So if you do have a PO box, but you're sleeping by the river, you let them know that, and they will find the ward that you go to vote in, and you'll vote, and then you sign an affidavit that that's where you live.
Yeah, it's the same. A way that it helps to think about it is that what they're really trying to do is assign you to the closest precinct. So saying where you spend the most time, whether it's, in most states you can say it's the corner of Main and 3rd, or, we were working with a group of folks who were living in tents in the woods, right? It's just for the state to know, all right, you're here, so your closest voting precinct is going to be X place. If it comes to mailing a ballot, then they often, depending on the state, won't necessarily do it to the post office, but you can usually go pick it up at the county clerk. But for registration, it's the same as Sue saying, is that you really want it to be where they are spending the most amount of time. Like, a lot of folks may not sleep in the same place every night, but they may, always be near X food bank or something like that, but you just want it to be cross streets that are close enough that they can assign them to the closest precinct.
Right. This is about making sure that they're voting in the community that they're a part of, and so they can vote for the people who are representing them and the place where kind of they're interacting every day. That makes sense. And then Sue, I know you mentioned that you're doing some work on language access, especially for immigrants and refugees. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, in terms of voting, we have translated information about how to register into 5 different languages: Nepali, Arabic, Swahili, Spanish, French. I think that's it. I got them all. And we're hoping to go door to door with that information. We've put it in, where we will be putting it in stores and public places where people go. And we do hope to go door to door with that, just encouraging, of course, as everybody knows, in areas that are underrepresented, candidates are not going there to hear what's going on or to hear the thoughts and concerns of people. The parties don't canvass in those areas. So we're trying to fill that gap. And those are areas where, especially new immigrants, but not all immigrants, live.
Great. And then Jessica, I know something that you mentioned when we first connected was that you're starting to do some work to register voters in encampments. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that, kind of what that effort will look like?
Yes, there'll be outreach from local volunteers. Manchester Housing Alliance, for one, will be doing a lot of the work and coordinating with some of the other advocates out there. Sorry, I had to switch to a dark area to be able to have my battery. So it will be getting out literature that tells them how they can go vote, little slips of paper to be able to hand out, walk amongst the camps, pass them out. Unfortunately, you can't do stuff like organize a meal for when they come, because that could be seen as buying a vote. Because I wish I could do other outreach together with it. But it will be basically getting that information out and organizing rides amongst volunteers who are willing to go pick up at the encampments or specified areas, bring them to the polling locations, hopefully maybe one in each ward or one for a couple wards, and help get the people there and back, because that's really a lot of it too. They stay localized around services. Not all voting locations are that close. So it's really about getting them there and getting the education into their hands to know that they actually have that voice.
Totally. Yeah, that's so important. We're definitely excited to hear about how those efforts go. And giving rides to the polls is one of the most valuable things you can do, especially on election day. So something that when we were putting together this Tenant Talk edition, we were looking into this new wave of voter suppression laws that have been enacted really over the past 2 years. And I believe that one of them was a stricter voter ID law in New Hampshire. Is this something that you have encountered and something that you've been working to address?
Yeah, it's not, it will come up in the next legislature. It came up in this one, it was defeated, but it will come up in the next one. And it does have to do with, I'm not sure, maybe Jessica knows more about it than I do, but I think it has to do with domicile. We've had a domicile issue regarding students and whether or not they can vote in our elections. Can they, and campaign workers, can they vote here? So the newest legislation would require something like 2 weeks registering. Again, I'm not sure of the details, but it would seriously impact the military. So that's one side that's opposed to it. I don't know if Jessica knows more about that one. But basically, yeah, there's a lot, they're trying to suppress the vote just as much as they possibly can.
Yeah, and Kat, not to kind of throw this on you, but I know this is kind of in your wheelhouse. How has this new wave of voter suppression laws been affecting your work?
It's affected my liver. I think that what we have seen, 2020, we saw incredible voter turnout because, thank you, COVID. COVID did two great things. It let me spend a year at home, which is all I've ever wanted, is just not to have to go to parties. And then the other thing that it did was that it increased voter turnout because people finally had to do all the things we've been begging them to do. But then 2021, they were like, oh my God, when you mail people ballots and have drop boxes and stuff, then more people vote. This is a nightmare. And so then there was this massive wave of suppression, and Congress did not pass any voting legislation whatsoever. And so what we have really seen, on the ID side, it impacts things in ways in that, the Supreme Court has now said it's totally fine to require IDs for absentee voting, and they can force them to make a copy. And basically you can make it as difficult as you want if the Supreme Court is going to allow it. And so it's made it difficult in that way. That has made it much more difficult for folks who are elderly or who have disabilities, who usually were able to vote from home without IDs, and also have high percentages of folks who don't have IDs, and things like that. But also there are, most of the millions of people who don't have ID just didn't have it in the first place. Where it has really made a difference is that, I think there are a lot of people who thought, oh, well, Congress will fix this and we'll fix the Voting Rights Act and then everything will be fine. And what we are just really having to constantly tell people is no one is going to save us. We have to save ourselves. If we want to save this country, we have to do it ourselves. There is no one coming, right? There is no Voting Rights Act that's going to be passed anytime soon. We have midterms coming, and it is up to people to get themselves out, to get their friends out, to get their family out, to get everybody out, to really focus on how many people in my community can I get out, because it's not, Supreme Court isn't helping, nobody's going to do anything. It has become much more difficult to vote in most states, and the Supreme Court is going to really deal some body blows to elections next year. We know one particular case that they're looking at that is going to make 2024 very difficult. And so the thing that has changed is that people have to stop thinking that some institution is going to save them, because it's not. This is where we are right now.
Very true.
Yeah, it's a scary reality. I know we've talked about before on this series that ultimately the burden of voter registration, ultimately that shouldn't be something that's on on individuals and on organizers, but as being a citizen in a democracy, it shouldn't be so hard. But of course, we know that it is, and that's why we're here, putting together all of our resources, all of our brain power, all of our energy to out-organize these barriers, while also working towards the policy change that will make it so these barriers don't exist, even if that's more of a long game. Yeah, so we also got a question from Lathea. Can voters be registered in mental health crisis centers? Not sure if anyone has experience with registering voters.
In mental
crisis
health centers, I think it depends on if they're a ward. I know certain things do come into play, but I don't think it would fully stop someone depending on status and everything.
Yeah, I guess just to add to that, just from the question, I'm not sure if you mean like, can a mental health center hold a voter registration drive, or can people who are in mental health centers register to vote? I'm on that question, you know, it just depends on whether or not a state has adjudicated that you're not competent to handle your own matters. If that is the case, then you can't vote on your own. Unless that has happened, you can.
Got it. And I think it would also have to do with like different questions around like duration of residency and when the deadlines are, whether they're short term. Okay.
Absolutely, but just the specific sort of mental health question, if that's where you were going. But yeah, then there's all of the other voter registration questions still apply.
Mm-hmm. Are there, kind of related, there's rules around voting by mail, like if you experience a last minute emergency and are hospitalized? Is that, I feel like I don't know much about this, but I've encountered that this exists.
I was just about to say, I think the other question kind of falls to that answer a little bit, but incorporates what Kat said. Are you allowed to, basically, depending on your status, able to advocate for yourself or no? First and foremost, that's going to be a question. But second, that's kind of what the absentee ballot was really created for in the beginning. You're going to be away from your home. There's an illness or something keeping you away.
Got it. Right. Yeah, these have been around for a while. And then isn't there some origin with mail-in ballots in the Civil War as well, right?
That one I haven't heard back to. That it does make me curious more and more now.
Yeah, you're totally right. They did. We've been voting by mail since the beginning of this country. I just put a thing in chat. So we have a website called readtheeffingdirections.com. It's targeted towards young voters because young voters are 5 times more likely to have their ballots thrown out when they mail them in. And a lot of that is because the directions are confusing and young people have never voted before. So we are currently in the process of updating it with all of the new rules for midterms. But that if you can go on there, you can share that website. It lays out all the rules for every state, even like where to get a stamp, which I know that sounds crazy, but actually if you Google where to get a stamp, you just get a lot of ads for stamps.com, and it's very confusing for young people. Also, if you go on there and there is a question, a vote by mail rule that we don't have on there, then feel free to send me an email and say, hey, I have this question and it's not on there, and we will update that as well. So we've tried to make it a very comprehensive website about all the vote by mail rules and make it easy for people to understand.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great resource to have. We got a question from someone in New Jersey pointing to both the unhoused and undocumented communities that may be afraid to talk to people. And I know it's a little bit different because we're not registering undocumented people to vote, but still in terms of interacting relating to like social services. What are some pieces of advice for interacting with populations that may be intimidated or kind of not want to have those interactions with authority figures?
So we partner with organizations that they do trust, right? So what are the churches, what are the shelters, what are the food banks, what are the case managers, whoever is a resource that community does trust. If you partner with them, then they know, okay, we can trust this organization, these folks coming in, because it's, our church says that it's okay. So it's really important to have that conduit of trust, because you're right, being afraid of authority figures or just random folks is real. And so that sort of middleman partnership really helps.
Definitely, that comes into play for many different things, from trying to get into minority communities for them to trust you and welcome you in. Just the same as going to a homeless encampment. It's not really suggested just to walk up on it. It's highly suggested to find other advocates that you can speak to first, and that will take you in there to speak with them, because most likely you're going to plan something outside of that area. Most of them do not want their housing discovered, because that means threat of it being dismantled and then made to move again. So if you were under that threat, just you put yourself in that spot and you can understand why, because at first it's kind of confusing. You want to help, you don't know why they're not receptive. But when you realize it's their housing in jeopardy, you kind of do understand. So like in New Hampshire, we have Manchester Housing Alliance, who has a good connection with MARF. And MARF does a lot of work with, they have a free store on Sundays where the homeless are able to come out and get tents or blankets, needed supplies, stuff like that. So really those type of grassroots agencies are great for that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really important, that when building trust, you have to connect with the people who are already connected and not just kind of show up and assume that you're wanted there and will kind of be immediately accepted. And something we talk about a lot is using positive messaging and really connecting the importance of voting to what people are experiencing, rather than kind of talking down and saying, you need to be registered, you need to vote. Say, voting is important because it can address the issues you're facing directly in your life and can be a pathway to change. So there's definitely important ways to message that and to address the power dynamics that can be inherent in reaching out to and registering and mobilizing people who have traditionally been excluded or disenfranchised. I'm not seeing any other questions coming into the chat yet. And I know Sue has to hop off a minute early. So Sue, thank you so much for joining us. Does anyone have any last comments before we close out? If not, then I just want to thank our incredible panelists for joining today, and also just everyone in the chat for sharing so many experiences, sharing all of the work that you're doing, the obstacles that you've personally faced and overcome. We really wouldn't be anywhere without all of you being part of this movement. So just grateful to have you all on today, and hope to see you 2 weeks from now. Our next webinar will be the Tuesday after Labor Day, because the Monday 2 weeks from now is Labor Day. And that will be on the topic of ballot measures and housing, which is another personal passion of mine. I did see we just got a question on the way out, getting information about candidates who want to work with people experiencing homelessness. I would say, I know, Kat, you are working on voter guides. That may be something that's included there, or connecting with your local housing justice organizations that are doing candidate questionnaires.
I'd be willing to bet with all this hard work, we might be hearing from them next year, though.
Yes, that's the hope, is that we build this power and we show that we are a force. We are bringing pro-housing voters to the polls, and we did a lot of relationship building with candidates on NLIHC's end in the 2020 elections. I know, in partnership with Granite State Organizing Project, and I think that's only going to become a bigger thing as the power of this movement grows next year and this year. All right. Yeah, feel free to stick around if you have any last questions, but I think that brings us to the end for today. Thanks so much, everyone. All right, I'm going to close this out.